Hello, I'm Adam Wren.
And I'm Irie Sentner. It's Thursday, August 21st.
And this is the Playbook Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming White House reporter and West Wing Playbook co-author Irie Sentner to the show. Good morning, Irie.
Good morning, Adam.
Irie, typically I am slacking you a question about the vice president, so it's good to actually have you in full 3D color here today.
It's great to see you too.
Let's get right to what's driving the day. First up, Vice President JD Vance heads to Peachtree, Georgia today to talk up the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and that could present some challenges. To start, the polling on the law suggests an uphill battle for Republicans. The headlines are a challenge too. In Georgia, I kind of did a scan of what Georgians have been reading this week, a lot about cuts to rural hospitals and, quite frankly, a little bit of rough sledding for the VP messaging this. He's gone to Pennsylvania, he's gone to Ohio, and you've had a lot of coverage of this here. We're kind of hearing a little bit of pushback from the MAGA universe, particularly Steve Bannon, who spent a lot of time on his podcast yesterday talking about how he doesn't think Congress is selling this signature accomplishment by the president in a way that befits the scope of it. And so I'm curious, how do you see Vance coming into this, and can he make the pitch here?
So Vance's superpower in the White House is that he is great at staying on message, and he has this hillbilly elegy background that he can use to talk about this. So I think the White House would consider it a win if the people in Georgia are not talking about cuts to Medicaid. Instead, they are talking about manufacturing. Vance wants to bring domestic manufacturing back. We know that that's what he's expected to focus on. He's also expected to focus on tax cuts, and he's also expected to attack Senator Jon Ossoff, who, of course, is coming up against a pretty high-profile midterm fight. So if we're not talking about Epstein, and we're not talking about Medicaid, and we're talking about domestic manufacturing, I'm sure the White House will be very happy.
You mentioned Jon Ossoff. He, in remarks leading up to today, called this a damage control mission from Vance, which I think is interesting. But speaking of damage control, you were with the vice president yesterday at Union Station as he did an off-the-record photo op with the members of the National Guard. They got Shake Shack together. Pretty chaotic scene. It seems like the administration feels like they have a messaging win on the National Guard crackdown in Washington. Take us into what you saw yesterday, and also where you think the vice president's head is at, going from that to a battleground state.
I think you hit it right on the head when you said it was chaotic. As someone who was there, we had this split screen where the vice president and Stephen Miller and Pete Hegseth, they're sticking to their talking points. They're thanking the troops like the vice president does a lot, right? But then down below on the first floor of this giant cavernous train hall, we have all of these protesters saying free DC, free DC. It's echoing to the point where, nobody can really ignore it. So then, you can kind of see the vice president and Stephen Miller think about how they're going to spin this. They say, we're going to free DC from crime. They start talking about how all of these protesters are old white hippies. Stephen Miller says they need to all go home and take a nap because they're all over 90. It was this very interesting messaging happening in real time. And so, I'm sure the vice president is excited to enter a more controlled setting like the rally today in Peachtree.
Yeah, and when we look back at the other messaging events that the vice president has done on behalf of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in Pennsylvania and then in Northern Ohio, it does seem like he's taken questions. At least I know at the Ohio event, he took questions. If you were at this event, what would you want to ask him?
All eyes right now are on Ukraine and Russia and what's happening there. And I think especially with the vice president, he's been one of the most outspoken critics of US support for Ukraine. And now we're at a point where Playbook reported earlier this week that the president is considering all of these security guarantees, including potentially even a peacekeeping force. And so I'd be interested in hearing the vice president square how he's perhaps evolved on the issue or how he's coaching the president to move forward.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we're going to be watching over the next few days. The second big story today concerns the ongoing mid-cycle redistricting battles unfolding around the country. Yesterday, the Republican-controlled Texas House voted to advance the new Trump-favored GOP gerrymander, and the state Senate takes up the proposal today. Meanwhile, in California, the Democratic-controlled state legislature is likely to vote today to push through its blue gerrymander as a counter to Texas. In both states, the dominant party looks likely to net 5 House seats. Irie, this has been one of the central topics of the week, and it's hard to tell if there's any other shoe to drop here. We know the Indiana lawmakers are headed to the White House next Tuesday to talk on this after Vice President Vance visited them with the full weight and power of the vice presidential motorcade cruising towards the State House, sitting down with them. I'm curious, they want to move some of these red states to act. Where do you expect this story to head next?
I mean, we can never be sure, but I think we're going to be seeing a broader redistricting war happen. Texas's move yesterday is prompting a countermeasure from California. The Senate in California is going to be voting on redistricting today. I think we'll also be seeing similar efforts potentially in New York and Illinois. And so I think we could potentially be seeing a tit for tat happen with red states and blue states.
And that brings us to the third big story of the day, which is about the intersection of economic power, the presidency, and the legal system. The Federal Reserve's annual economic policy conference kicks off today in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and it comes at a politically fraught moment for the Fed. Of course, President Donald Trump is battling with Chairman Jerome Powell, and he looks to exert even greater influence over the central bank. The latest on that front is Trump's effort to push Lisa Cook, the first Black woman to be a Fed governor, to resign. Federal Housing Finance Agency head Bill Pulte accused Cook of mortgage fraud and said he was making a criminal referral to the Justice Department. Cook fired back yesterday in a statement saying, quote, "I have no intention of being bullied to step down from my position because of some questions raised in a tweet." And as always, we like to end the show with something from the Playbook newsletter. Yesterday, Florida Senator Rick Scott was out in California touring the Pacific Palisades neighborhood that was devastated by the fires earlier this year. His tour guide was a bit of a surprise and a name you probably haven't heard in a long time. Spencer Pratt, who was made famous by MTV's mid-aughts reality show, The Hills. Irie, I have to date myself and said that I was wrapped on The Hills circa 2008. Pratt and his wife and former co-star Heidi Montag lost their home in the fires and subsequently sued the city of Los Angeles earlier this year. And since then, he's emerged as something of a conservative political influencer. He traveled to Washington earlier this month to meet with Attorney General Pam Bondi about holding California officials accountable for what he believes to be a subpar emergency response. Irie, I'm afraid to ask here, as an elder millennial, what you were doing in 2008 and whether or not you were aware of The Hills as a thing that was happening.
Adam, I was not allowed to watch The Hills because I was 6 years old.
And little did you know the rest of your story, as Natasha Bedingfield said in the song that opened up The Hills, the rest was still unwritten. Send us your tips, birthdays, and spotted moments to Playbook at Politico.com. Irie, thanks so much for joining the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's all for today's Playbook podcast, but we have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at Politico.com/Playbook. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great Thursday.